Hello everyone. This video is all about our experimental survey research project and the final paper that is associated with it. The final paper is due the last day of class, which is July 25th by 11:59 p.m. So I wanted to break down the different steps. So unlike the observational research project, which only takes place between weeks 1 through 3, the experimental research project will take place throughout the entire 6-week semester. So step 1, you should familiarize yourself with the survey we're going to be using. So this is during week 1. So I've already published a Word document or a PDF of the survey that has already been created by a previous social psych course. So the reason I'm doing this is because since this is only a 6-week course, we don't have a lot of time to do votes on what our topic should be and what the survey should be. And my last 3 or 4 classes have all chosen the same topic. So I'm using a previous survey to allow us to kind of streamline the process a little bit. So on Canvas, I've already published a PDF that includes all the different questions that are featured on our survey that we'll be using and what they measure or what they mean. So step 2 is to send out a recruitment post. So ideally during week 2, you should do this. When I say send out, I mean you can post it on your social media. You can text the link to friends or family that you think might be interested. And to make those posts shareable, so to encourage the people who are interested into sharing our link with others they feel might be interested in participating. So this is referred to as snowball sampling. So I provide an email example that you are more than welcome to copy and paste and use just to put just input your name. Instead, I leave that blank. So feel free to use that. I've also published that on Canvas. And then also during week 2, you should be conducting your literature review assignment. So after familiarizing yourself with the survey, you'll understand that it's about the presence of visible tattoos and how that may impact another person's judgment of that individual tattoos, or their perception. So you are to conduct a literature review on that topic. So I'll go into depth on the next slide what the literature review assignment is, but you're expected to find 4 relevant sources that are relevant to our survey's topic. And that assignment's due at the end of week 2. Then due at the end of week 4 is the data analysis. So during week 2, I will be checking how many people have completed the survey, and I will then export our Qualtrics survey into an SPSS file. I will publish that SPSS file on Canvas before week 4, so probably towards the end of week 3, I will try to get us the maximum amount of participants as possible, so I'll try to wait as long as I can. And then I'll clean that up, put it in a data file for SPSS, and publish it on Canvas. And then you all will be using that file for data analysis in step 4. And then step 5 kind of starts in week 2, but writing your final paper. So you do not have to wait until the last week to write your final paper. Since you have access to the survey, you have access to enough information to successfully fill out your introduction, to successfully write a portion of the method section, because you'll have the survey, so you'll understand what's going on. You also understand the data collection or data recruitment process as well. So you can write those elements early on. And then week 4, you'll have the results, and I'll provide feedback on your data analysis submission, whether or not you presented it correctly in APA style, and if you interpreted correctly. And then all you have left to do with the last 2 weeks is write your discussion. So I highly recommend pacing out the writing of your paper. That way you aren't leaving it until the final week. Then the last step is step 6. Submit your final paper to Canvas. So it's due, again, the last day of classes. However, if you finish it early, you are more than welcome to submit it early. That submission box is open on the first day of class. So you're more than welcome to submit like your literature review assignment early, your final paper early. The only thing you really can't submit early potentially would be like the data analysis, just because you won't have the file until probably halfway through week 3. So going in depth on the literature review assignment. So students will use UWM's online library resources to find 4 relevant peer-reviewed scientific articles. So again, relevant to our survey's topic of visible tattoos and how that can impact people's perception of that person. With UWM, they have a bunch of different databases. I do provide a data file or a PDF on Canvas detailing how to utilize UWM's online resources. So it's how to find an article or a peer-reviewed article. Feel free to use that. It's a step-by-step guide on how to use UWM's online databases. So these articles need to be peer-reviewed, which there's a box you can click on the resources to make sure you're only getting peer-reviewed. This also means that you can't use like book chapters, you can't use dissertation or thesis, because those are not peer-reviewed. So you are wanting to use only scientific articles that have been published in scientific journals. So once you find your 4 articles, you will then provide a thorough summary of each article in your own words. So I don't want the abstract copy and pasted. I don't want the AI summary of it. I want it in your own words. And then after the summary, you will then provide an explanation on how you feel this article is relevant to our survey's topic. And you will also provide an explanation of how you plan to use this article for your final paper, and basically just talking about what you learned from that specific article. So you should do this second bullet point 4 different times. So you need 1 summary per article. So you should have 4 summaries. You need 1 explanation per article. So talking specifically about why each of those articles is relevant. So you do that 4 times. And you provide an explanation of how you're going to utilize this in your final paper and what you learned from it. So again, that has to be specific to each article. And then at the end of your literature review, where you're done writing about those 4 articles, you will then provide the hypotheses for your final paper. So I say hypotheses because this project requires the results of 2 statistical analyses, and typically there is 1 hypothesis for each independent-dependent variable pairing. So with 2 independent-dependent variable pairings, you then should have 2 hypotheses. So, and these hypotheses should be rooted in what you learned from those 4 relevant articles. And then at the very end of the assignment, you should provide an APA formatted reference page of the 4 articles you used. And again, this is due at the end of week 2. So for your data analysis submission, again, I will provide an SPSS file on Canvas. I'll make an announcement when I publish it. Please use the provide data file. Do not try to create your own, because you will not have the information for it. So I will provide the data file with all of our participants. Using that data file, you then will independently analyze the results using whichever dependent variables you chose from the survey. So there's 4 different choices for dependent variables. You can choose which ones you want to pursue. Then you'll complete at least 2 statistical tests. One of those statistical tests has to be an independent samples t-test using that survey viewed or photo viewed variable as your independent variable. So what that variable is it basically says which survey participants completed. Did they see the individual with visible tattoos, or did they see the individual with no tattoos? And I provide the photos on Canvas as well, so you have an idea of what your participants are seeing. So for this submission, you should include your SPSS output file only. You don't need to include the data file, because I already have the data file and everybody's using the same data file. So your output file with the results of your 2 statistical analyses and a document writing about those, the outcome of those statistical analyses in APA format. This is due at the end of week 4. So I also want to highlight, I do provide a how-to guide on how to t-test or how to complete a t-test, it can be found in the SPSS how-to guides page, which I do believe I have linked in the course materials module, but I'm also linking it in the project module as well. So now I want to get into the specifics of the paper. So this final paper will be a full APA style report. There's no specific word count or page limit per se, but you need to make sure you're including all of the criteria. This is a very brief overview of the instructions and the grading rubric that I have published on Canvas. So please make sure you are referring to that rubric as you are completing your paper. Treat that rubric as a roadmap to successfully completing your paper. So for the main elements, the main sections of the paper, for your introduction has to feature a review of relevant literature. So this is where if you did a really good job on your literature review assignment, this portion's already written for you. So the introduction requires 4 peer-reviewed articles. They have to be properly cited in text, so you have to have in-text citations. And one of the articles that you use can be one that I provide for you on Canvas. The Broussard and Harton 2018 article, it's linked in the week 4 material, may be a really good fit because it is about the impact of visible tattoos. You are more than welcome to use that. You can only use one article that I've already provided for you. You do have to find 3 of them on your own. Then on that introduction, you have to provide rationale for the current study. So what gaps in the research is our survey filling? Why is it important? And then at the end, you must have a paragraph about the present study talking about your hypotheses. So clearly stating your hypotheses. And again, you should have one hypothesis for each independent dependent variable pairing. Your introduction should be written using the hourglass method. So starting really wide, talking in general terms, and then getting more and more specific as you get towards talking about your present study. Again, with the literature review as well, this should be written in a more cohesive way. So don't just list out your articles and provide a summary. You need to have, segues and, explanations. It needs to read like a research paper. So if you are struggling with how to present your research in your final paper, I highly recommend circling back to one of your articles and seeing how they presented their past research and how they integrated that into their introduction. So now the method section. So the method section is a section that will contain multiple subsections. So you need the relevant subsections. So you need to talk about our materials. So you need to talk about our survey, how many questions it was. You have to provide accurate information. So about how long it took to complete, how many questions. And then you have to provide at least 2 specific questions from your dependent variable of choice. Again, all that can be found on the survey PDF that I provided on Canvas. Additionally, you have to have participants paragraph. So you have to include information on our sample. So this means when you receive the data file, you will have to run what's called frequency analyses. And I also provide, if you are unsure how to do that, I provide a how-to guide on Canvas in that SPSS information page. So with the frequency, it will give you a total number of how many participants we had. We'll have a total number per group, so how many saw our tattooed individual or our experimental survey, how many saw our control survey. We also have some demographic information, including age, gender identity, education level, and I want to say race and ethnicity. So you should include a demographic breakdown of who our sample is. And the reason you want to provide that information is because you want to be able to make a statement on who our data is generalizable to. And if you don't provide the demographic information, people don't understand who this data can be applied to. So again, I already talked about this, providing the accurate information from our survey. All the questions used in our survey can be found on that survey document. In the example recruitment email, I include how many total questions and how long approximately it should take. And again, you must use at least 2 sample dependent variable questions that you use for your analysis. So you have to provide those sample questions within the method section. So moving to the results section. So you need to complete at least 2 statistical analyses and accurately present them in APA style. This is where if you did that data analysis submission really well, you already have most of this done. So again, one of the analyses has to be an independent samples t-test. The other can be another t-test or it can be a chi-square depending on the variable or question you're choosing as your dependent variable. I do want to highlight chi-squares can only be used for categorical variables. Categorical variables are answers to specific questions that rely on dummy codes, so the numerical value doesn't mean anything. This will be the combo variables I detail in the code book that I'll publish. So this is for specific questions only. If you are not using one specific question, you will be using another independent samples t-test. So as I mentioned before, one of your t-tests has to use the IV photo viewed variable. So again, this is basically the survey viewed variable. It tells us whether somebody was in the experimental group or control group. This is line 71 in the data file. And you must include at least one APA formatted table or figure to display your results. I provided a link to Purdue OWL that talks in depth about how APA tables and figures are formatted. I also provide the APA assistance page and the SPSS how-to guides in the course material modules on our Canvas homepage that should help with this step. So I do want to talk a little bit about independent samples t-tests and what the results mean. So t-tests are used to test for significant differences between groups for continuous variables. So continuous variables are variables where the scores have meaning and are not dummy codes. So this would be like total perception or total trust. When we are looking at continuous variables, the score means something. So there is a meaning if somebody has a score of 1 versus if somebody has a score of 10. There's meaning to that. So appropriate dependent variables for this analysis would be the perceived professionalism, total trust, total general impressions, and total perception variables. Appropriate independent variables, the easiest one to use would be that photo view variable because it's already in 2 groups. Independent samples t-test, again, only utilizes 2 different groups. So if you want to use any demographic variables or any of the post-survey questions that we have, so we do have some post-survey questions that ask how the individual feels about tattoos, whether or not they have tattoos. You can sort them into 2 groups. Make sure you are paying attention to the codes. So independent sample t-test, the photo viewed group's already dummy coded into 1 and 2, which is automatically what's put on SPSS. If you use a different variable, it will automatically use that 1 and 2 unless you type differently. So some of those variables with different choices, like our gender identity variable, you want to make sure. I do believe the gender identity variable is already coded to where 1 and 2 will be man and woman, which typically are the most common choices. However, if you want to use something different beyond the first 2 choices of whichever demographic variable or post-survey question, you will then need to change the codes that are in the independent samples t-test SPSS. So if you are struggling with that, please feel free, reach out to me. I'm happy to provide a further explanation. So last written section is the discussion section. So in this section, you must clearly state whether your hypotheses found support. So did you find, through the data analysis, did you find support or not? You must circle back to at least 2 of the articles from your literature review and your introduction and discuss your findings in terms of the past research you presented in the introduction. Additionally, you have to provide at least one alternative explanation for the results. So I do talk about alternative explanations in one of my lecture videos. I highly recommend you watch that video before trying to write your alternative explanation section on this. Identify at least one limitation. So do you feel there's any confounding variables? If you were to do this study, what would you do differently? And then provide at least one direction for future research. So again, this is where if you do this study over, what would you change? Would you change the questions? Would you change the image? Just giving a direction of if somebody were to repeat this. And then I always round out my discussion session with sort of like a take-home message. So not just ending it on, if I could do this again, this is what I'd do. Sort of providing a take-home short paragraph at the end, sort of summarizing, talking about the results, but also, what this means for the future. So if you felt like more research needed to be done or something like that, providing a take-home message. And then lastly, your reference page. So this is where if you did a really good job on your literature review assignment and you created that reference page for your literature review assignment and you did it correctly in APA formatting, this section's already done. So this section can be done in week 2 if you do the literature review assignment correctly. And again, one of the articles you can use for that literature review assignment for your introduction can be one that I provide for you on Canvas if it is appropriate or relevant to your paper. So some reminders, make sure you're checking the APA manual and or Purdue OWL to ensure you're meeting APA style standards. As you'll see when you read the rubric, there is a section of the grade specifically about APA formatting and whether or not you stuck with APA formatting. Make sure you are referring to the rubric regularly. Again, treat that like not only a checklist of what has to be included, but a roadmap on to successfully completing this final paper. And again, make sure you are utilizing the sources that are provided for you. So I provide a lot of pages, how-to guides, APA style references. I provide an APA sample paper. Make sure you are using those to ensure that you are not only meeting expectations of APA format, but also the expectations for this paper. So since this paper is due on the last day of class, which is July 25th, I only accept late papers 2 days past the original due date instead of 3, with, again, that 10% deduction per day late. So please make sure you are not putting this off to the last minute. This is the largest assignment for this class, so please do not put it off till the last minute. As you're working on your paper, if you have any questions or if you have any questions over the rubric, anything like that, please feel free to email me. I'm more than happy to help clarify. Thank you for watching.